All right. So today we are going to look at the first half of the book of Job. And so before we start, I just want to do what I do always in my classes when we start a new book. I take a poll. I take a poll to get an idea of how you reacted to the text. So my poll is from 1 to 10. So 1 is like, it was a horrible experience, you want to drop the class, right? And 10, it was ecstatic, you loved it, this is like, you're going to memorize this book, right? It was so amazing. Okay, so from 1 to 10, I'm going to turn on to the gallery view. Any 10s for the book of Job? Anybody was ecstatic? Nobody's ever, Wilkes, no way. Okay, one ecstatic person. Okay, any 9s for the book of Job? All right, Aline, good. Vargas, 8, 7, 6, 5. Oh, Critchell and Cohen. 4, 3. Oh, Milgram. 2, 1, 0. Okay, let's start with the haters. Milgram, Cohen, Critchley. Critchley, is that you? Wait, Critchell. Speak to us. What happened?
Um, well, I didn't interpret 5 as necessarily like I hated it. I just felt it was really repetitive, especially when Job's friends were talking and all kind of just saying the same thing and like a different, phrasing it in different, like flowery ways. But it wasn't too bad. Just I felt that part was a lot.
I'm laughing because your reaction is typically Western, right? You want to get to the damn point, like where you're going on and on, right? You're really entering into the Oriental worldview, right? Where, we in the Middle East, right? It's all embellishment, and even in the architecture, right? Even in the way they write, right? So this is very, very typical of, like, get to the point. Why you got to say it in like 10 sentences, right? Just say it in one sentence. So I enjoy your reaction. It's very authentically Western. Excellent. Anybody else from the haters? Who was,
I just thought it was a little confusing when I was reading it. And it's not that I hate the book.
okay.
Yeah, it's
Okay, it is confusing. Actually, you're right to say that. If you think the book is clear, you've misread it. So very good. Who is our biggest hater? Milgram. Go ahead, Milgram. Speak to us.
Oh, I also didn't hate it. It was like fine. Like I didn't realize 5 was hate or 4. I stood for. Um, but something that I didn't like was that it didn't really feel like much was happening after like the beginning when like you first hear like Job is great and then bad things happen to him. It was just like a constant dialogue, which like maybe some people appreciate, but like I appreciate stories more where like there are more like moving parts and like things are happening more throughout the story. And I also thought it was repetitive, just like
Hey,
Robin.
yes. I was gonna say, I was gonna compare you to. Okay, who were you? Was it Cohen? Who was? Wait, who were you? Critchell. Critchell. Yes. This is, we're used to things going quickly, right? So what is this, like on and on and so very good reactions. You're really reading and reacting, which is what I want. I want reactions. Excellent. Let's take a couple lovers. I think there was Wilkes and there was one more. Alim. Let's hear something from you guys.
Um, for me, on the contrary, I really liked the structure of the story. Like, I just really enjoy how it's like a dialogue in the middle, similar to the Song of Songs. I really enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed this as well. And I also really like just the Eastern view, like a lot. So I don't know, this story was just great for me, and I can't wait to finish it.
Okay, so felt a little more comfortable in the style. Very good. Alim, would you like to share?
I really liked like the poetic style of the dialogue. I think like there was also like a lot of references, and I had fun like looking them up. Like one of them said, "Oh, like he made like the bear, like it was like something like that, the bear, the scorpion, something." And then I looked it up, and it's not about the animals actually. It's about like the constellations in the sky that like are like that God made. So like there's like so much depth in the poetic language. Like I had like a lot of fun like interpreting it.
Okay, very good, right? So you'll notice, right, if you're more scientific view, you're gonna, this is not gonna be your cup of tea. You'll enjoy probably better people like Nietzsche or Maimonides, right? So we have for both minds, so don't worry, right? If you're having trouble with the poetry, you will soon get a nice rigorous argument in the next text we're gonna do. Okay, very good reactions. All right, let's get briefly in the text. Before I do so, I'm going to chide some of you for falling into the trap I told you not to fall into, which is to think that the God of the prologue is God, right? In other words, that the way that God is described in the prologue, that it is actually the God that the writer is trying to tell us about, right? So some of you talked about him as though he was the Hebrew God or the God of the Bible. He's not, right? Remember, the God of the prologue, this is ironic. He's making fun. And then we're going to find the actual Hebrew God, not in the prologue, but where? Where are we going to find the God as the author wants us to know him? Remind me. In what section of the book? In the dialogues. Okay, very good. So the God of the prologue is not the Hebrew God. Everybody write this down, right? The God of the prologue is not the God of the Bible. He's not the Hebrew God. He's not the God that the writer of the book of Job wants us to encounter, right? The God of the prologue is more of represents more the ancients, the view of God of the ancients. So the author is kind of making a portrait of God as he was thought of by his contemporaries, right? Many people in the ancient world actually thought that God was just sitting on a throne playing with our destinies. That was the dominant worldview in the ancient world, right? We know this in Greek culture, right? In Greek culture, the gods are up there having fun, and occasionally they play little games with us, right? So this was also the view in Egypt. This was a view also in Babylon. So in general, in the ancient world, you had this view of God as, messing with our destinies just for the fun of having a nice poker game with the devil, right? So make sure you write this down, right? The God that is depicted in the prologue is not the God of the Bible. It's not the God that the author wants us to encounter. Is the God as he is perceived by the ancient world. Am I very clear on that? Put your hand in the screen if I made myself clear. Okay, don't make that mistake again. And if I see it in the test, I'm gonna take several points off, right? Right now you can still make mistakes because you're beginning with the reading and so forth, but if I see this in the test, let me tell you, it's going to sink you very low. I'm going to pull out my knives. All right. So let's go there, right? Let's go a little bit in the prologue. Let's talk about the prologue and this irony that we have there, and then we'll begin into the dialogue. So turn with me to the prologue, which begins on page 5. Let me make sure everybody's there. Who's there? Put your hand in the screen, page 5. Okay, very good. All right, so we don't also, so here we have, like I told you, we have God as perceived by the ancients, but we also have a certain definition of what it means to be spiritual here in the prologue as the ancients perceived it, right? But again, the author is going to move away from that way of being spiritual, right? So Job here represents a kind of simplistic form of belief, which the author wants to move away from, right? So whoever we're going to meet here, Job, the author is going to move away from that. So let's look a little bit at Job before. Who was Job before he began to suffer? Let's take a look. Now, it's going to be subtle in the text. The author is going to actually make fun of Job. So I'm going to see if any of you catch it, right? I'm going to read, and I want to see if you're able to catch where the author is making fun of Job. Okay, so here we go. So it begins, once upon a time in the land of Uz, there was a man named Job. Okay, so far so good. Then the author continues. He was a man of perfect integrity who feared God and avoided evil. So here we're like, oh, what a great man. And of course, at this point, we're expecting to hear about his virtues, about his, how kind he is, how many sacrifices he does every day, how much money he gives to the poor. And instead, what do we have? Can anyone tell me? Instead of a list of virtues of this great and noble man, what do we have? What kind of list do we have?
His wild animals.
Exactly. We had a shopping list of all of his possessions. He had 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, oxen, many slaves. He was the richest man of the East. Here you should already be laughing. What is the author doing and what is he telling us? Did anybody get where the author is making fun of Job? If you don't get it, it's okay, I'll explain, but I want to see if anybody gets it. Why does the author, yes, Alim, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I also see your other hand. Raise your hand virtually so I can see it. I don't see you when I'm talking to myself like this. So Alim, and then whoever else it was that I just caught a glimpse of your hand. You were wearing a sweater in this hot weather. And you were a girl. Okay, Alim, go ahead, tell us.
I feel like he's making fun of Job because Job defined blessing from God as being riches, like being riches. So I think that like a blessing from God would be like your health and other more important things like that. But he saw these like societal constructs, and then he thought that God had that like control and was giving it to him. And then when he made a mistake, well, he didn't make a mistake, but like when he got that taken away from him, he blamed God. But in reality, like God shouldn't be like responsible for that.
Okay, very good. You got it. Before I go into what you said, the other person who raised their hands, who were you? Do you remember yourself? Let's see. It was a wrestler. Wasn't it you, wrestler?
Yeah, I was gonna say like a very similar thing. So
Okay.
yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so excellent, right? Instead, right, we see that he's a God-fearing man. He has perfect integrity. And instead of seeing a list of how good he is, we see a list of how rich he is, right? As though the author is saying that for Job, right, virtue equals wealth. Okay, make sure you write this down. It seems that in the mind of Job, right, or at least in the mind of his contemporaries, in the mind of the ancients, right, which is what the author is poking at, right? Virtue equals wealth. In other words, he's simply highlighting the prevalent belief that still exists today, that if you follow God and if you're a good person, you're gonna be prosperous, you're gonna be wealthy. You just have to go to the section in Barnes and Nobles of Christianity to see how this is still true today, right? Everything is about, right, how God can make you rich, how God can help you find the perfect mate, how God can this, how God can that, like he's a big slave, right? That is supposed, or a servant, right? That is supposed to, right, this big Santa, right? So we are still living in this time that the author is criticizing, where we are under the impression that if I follow God, I'm gonna be happy, I'm gonna be wealthy, right? And Job believes it too. You can see that the way he's described, right? The way that his wealth is juxtaposed with his virtue. This is a subtle way that the author is telling us, when we read between the lines, that this is what Job believed. Okay, so make sure you write this down, that here in this passage, right, the author is telling us, by juxtaposing virtue with wealth, he's telling us that Job was in it for the money, right? Job was perhaps really in it for the money. And this is precisely what Satan, the accuser, was saying, right? So, and by the way, this is why Job, just to look a little bit at the Hebrew of this word perfect integrity, there are two words actually in the Hebrew, and this will tell us something very interesting. I'm going to write them in the chat. So the first word in the Hebrew is tam, and the second one is yashar. Okay, so it's interesting because, okay, yashar is good. Yashar means righteous. You are not moving to the left or to the right. You're consistent, right? Yashar actually literally means straight, right? So Job was indeed yashar. He was straight. He didn't, make compromises. He didn't make pacts with the devil. But the other word is a little more problematic. Tam actually means good, but in a naive sort of way. Good in a kind of simple sort of way, like the kind of person who's good because he's always been sheltered, right? So Mr. Nice Guy, right? It's easy to be good if you've always had it good, right? This is what tam means, right? Good in a naive sort of way, kind of. Job is nice, right? It's not that he's good, he's nice. I think I saw a question. Where'd it go? Milgram, go ahead.
Sorry, this was from before. How do we know that the God in the prologue is not the typical God?
Because the God we're going to meet in the dialogues is completely different, right? And also because remember I told you yesterday, the style. The author is telling us by making the style, the prose, poetry prose, remember the author in a way subtly, just through the style, is pointing our attention to the poetry, right? In other words, if we want to understand anything about anything, we can't look in the prologue or in the epilogue because the author is trying to move our attention to the dialogues, and this is where we ought to seek whatever we want to seek. Do you remember the argument I made last time about that?
Yeah. About that though, sorry, can I just make another comment?
Go ahead.
It seems like I definitely understand like that we should be focusing in the middle, and like I understand like the ABA structure, but it kind of seems like when we only focus in the middle, we're missing like a crucial part, which is like the fact, which kind of like goes back to the question that like has to do with suffering, like how could God have like allowed such a thing to happen, or like who is God to like say yes to like be messing up Job's life and things like that. So like I feel like if we only focus in the middle, we're kind of like skirting around like what at least personally like I'm interested in, and you know, like the idea of suffering.
Yeah, so absolutely. So the author of Job is going to respond exactly to your question. Where is God while I suffer? Who is God, right? But he's going to respond in the dialogues, right? So the question that the prologue poses, that's legit, but the prologue has no answers. That's my point, right? So the prologue is setting the stage, setting the characters, implying we need to move away from this type of characters into something else, right? So the question that is stated in the beginning is legit. You can absolutely, that's why the prologue is there, right? I'm not saying the prologue is, you know, let's not read it. We should read it, but realize that he's setting the stage from which we need to move, right? Am I making sense, Milgram?
Yeah, I think so.
My second question is, can you guys hear me good? Because I feel like I'm getting broken up. Can you hear me without interruption? It's okay.
I can hear you well personally.
Okay, so it's not me. Okay. Okay. Harpstark, go ahead. You have a question.
Okay, yeah. So back to what we were talking about before. You're like, I feel like it doesn't really seem necessary to, based on the first paragraph of this, say that Job is actually like naive and not, and maybe in it for the money, because why would the author say that if like he's then going to write this next part of the dialogue, and it seems like Job actually was pretty committed to God and like he didn't curse God, so like he knew that when he was writing this, so why does he need to like make fun of him and say that he was in it for the money? Because which maybe isn't even necessarily that bad, but that aside, like he doesn't seem like he was really only in it for the money. It seemed like he was committed to God.
Okay, good point. You're seeing that Job is, on the one hand, yes, he's Yashar. There is good in Job, but there is still this tam element, which, by the way, will not stay. Job is going to change, right? We're going to see that right now. How Job changes. The Job of the prologue is not the same Job as the Job that emerges from the suffering, right? So we'll see that Job in a way passes the test. But in the beginning, to be honest, anyone, by the way, who hasn't suffered is tam, right? They're nice because everything's good, right? You have to go through that suffering to go from tam to Chacham, which is a wise, which is what Maimonides is going to say, right? We're going to study Maimonides next. Maimonides actually says that Job in the beginning is he's naive, but in the end he's wise, right? So I'm not saying Job is going to stay that way. He's going to change, right? But part of him does remain there is integrity in Job, and that stays constant. You're right, the Yasha. I think I saw another hand, which was Wilkes, I think. Wilkes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add to the discussion and say that Job he's only naive because he's unevolved, and he sees his spirituality through this lens of material wealth other than the metaphysical world, which is like his mistake. It's not that he's like a sinner, it's just that he just doesn't understand this separate aspect of like real spirituality.
Exactly, right? Let's remember that the heroes of the protagonists, the characters of the Bible are never saints, right? This is, the people in the Bible have flaws, all of them, including even Adam and Eve. I can make the argument that they were flawed even when they were created, but that's another story, right? They're flawed and they have to grow. And the stories in the Bible show, right, what happens, how they can grow, and how we, in a way, when we read those stories, can find our own way through life. Right? So, okay, last point. Respler, go ahead.
Okay, I just had a question. Is it possible that the reason that there's the juxtaposition of like his virtue and like how great and righteous he was, and then all of his like wealth could be that the juxtaposition, the same juxtaposition of like Yashar and Tom, as in the explanation of his virtue is part of that Yashar piece, of just like his like being a like straight shooter and like all of that, and then the Tom piece kind of comes from the fact that he has this wealth, which I guess like could be foreshadowing to like the piece of like what he needs to get out of of him, like the piece of him that is Tom, that will be the thing that changes in the future.
Yes. Because the wealth changes, the time will change. Very good. I like very much your analysis. I think you're right. I like that. Very good. Okay, good. You guys are doing great. I like this. Don't ever hesitate to ask questions, because that allows me to go deeper, right? Okay, and of course we talked about, so we see Job, right? We see this portrait that the author is making of Job as being, he's good, but he's also naive. He still is Mr. Nice Guy. He's not yet reached the level that Maimonides will say of wisdom, right? And so the author is going to, in fact, want us to move away, right? And in fact, Job himself will move away and go through a transformation, which we're going to talk about right now, right? And just to remind you, we talked about God already, right? The character of God in the prologue is not supposed to be a portrait of the biblical God, right? This is a portrait of the God viewed by the ancient world, which we will also move away from, right? And of course, the last character, right, the accuser, you never find again, right? Because in the Hebrew worldview, there is only God. There is no force of good and evil. There is only one, right? Monotheistic culture. So you see how the author is starting with the ancient, or the worldview of the ancients. What does it mean who God is? What does it mean to be a believer? The accuser. And now as we enter the dialogues, you need to be aware we're entering a new cosmos. We're entering another world, which is the world that the author wants us to enter, wants us to see, wants us to learn from. Okay, everybody clear now about what the prologue is? And put your hand in the screen if you're following what I said about the prologue. Anybody still confused about the prologue and still feels like, but I like the prologue? Anybody? Okay, all right, let's get into the dialogue. So as we enter the dialogues, we start to see changes happening in Job's personality, right? He is changing. If you look at him, how he is in the prologue, and you see what he has become, right? There is a radical transformation. And so I want to talk a little bit about this transformation. I have found 3 points on which he changes. And I want to see if any of you can tell me what are some of the things that you think Job is. How is he different now from who we have just seen him to be in the prologue? Anybody can tell me what is the first shift that they notice in Job that doesn't correspond to the portrait we have of him in the prologue? I'm listening.
From the prologue to the dialogue, he starts to actually question God during his, like, when he's speaking to his friends in those 7 days that they're sitting with him in silence, and then they finally start to speak. In the beginning, it just seemed like the way I interpreted him was that he followed his faith not only for like materialistic things, but also out of fear of what would happen if he didn't, almost as if he followed it so he can be like, I did it, I'm safe just in case. I did what I was supposed to do, and that's it. But now he's at a part where he's still suffering, even though he thinks that he did everything right. Like he didn't break any of the rules in his head. And now when his friends are telling him, like, you have to still keep your faith, like you still need to still believe, like follow, like just because you were good doesn't mean that God's gonna keep blessing you with gifts. It's not all about getting good things. Doesn't mean that you're safe from ever feeling suffering. It's just like your faith means you have to still have faith even when things are bad. And that's when he's just like, but that makes no sense. Like, I don't understand why I have to still be positive when everything bad is happening to me. Like, I lost all my kids, everything that I have is now gone. And I think that's a part of growth. It's actually becoming a believer out of fear. He's becoming someone who's questioning the belief in itself of like, where is the benefit in me believing if this is what happens?
Okay, excellent. In your response, there's already 2 points, which I'll talk about in a second after I've gathered everyone. But absolutely, he moves from fear to an attitude, from a submissive attitude to an attitude of rebellion, questioning, right? Very good. Actually, let's write this down. Williams, I'll be right with you. Let's write this first distinction, right? He comes from a place of fear or submission, blind obedience, to a place of courage and rebellion, right? This is the first shift we have. Let me give you a couple quotes and then I'll listen to Williams. And then the rest of you keep on thinking. Okay, here's on page 23. And you have, if you go to the last paragraph on page 23, let me make sure everybody's here. Who is there on the last paragraph of page 23? Therefore, I refuse. Put your hand in the screen. Okay, very good, right? So he says this, he says, he says, therefore, I refuse to be quiet, and I will cry out my bitter despair. And then addressing God, he says, am I the sea or the serpent that you pen me behind a wall, right? I'll say, if I say sleep will comfort me, I will lie down to ease my pain, and so forth. And so he is, right, he refuses to be quiet, right? So this is an indication that Job has shifted from this kind of submissive kind of person doing everything right. Remember when his kids had a party, he would go after them, clean up, make a sacrifice to make sure they didn't sin. He was very like mousy, right? Now he's not mousy anymore, right? He's roaring. Very good. So that's the first point. Excellent. Williams, let's hear what you have to say.
It was basically similar to her. Basically, he went through something traumatic because everything seemed to crash down in that 1 second, because every time someone spoke, another person came through the door and said, taking this away from you, or something like that. So he took it as, you know, I cursed the day I was born. I curse, like, why did God, I didn't really understand it too much. He's like, why did God give birth to me if he'll ruin me, something like that.
Yes.
And I use that line as well, that, you know, he's going to speak on his anger. He's going to speak on his rebellion, basically. And he just took it as an anger because of that traumatic event. When you go through a denial, you go through anger, and then at the end you go through acceptance.
Right.
So
very good. Right. So you added something with regards to Rivera. You mentioned the way that he's now confused, right? It used to make sense. Everything used to make sense, but now he's like, why was I born? What's happening? Right. So this is actually the second one, right? He goes from being clear and from having a clear vision, like a clear vision of the rules of the game, right? Clarity, let's say, clarity, certainty, right? He moves into a state of confusion, right? The Job in the prologue knows how to play the game. If I do this, then this. If I do this, then that. Now all of a sudden, the rules have changed. It's not working, right? So he's confused. And the quote you mentioned is exactly the quote I had prepared on page 13, right? Where he's saying, let me make sure everyone's there. Page 13, everyone, the top of page 13. Okay, good. Right here, where he's saying, God damn the day that I was born. Like, why was I born? What's going on? What's happening? Right? You can sense here that he's not just angry, he's confused. He's frustrated. He doesn't understand what's happening. right? So that's second. Now there's a third, which no one ever gets. But it's the most obvious one. Anybody get the third difference between the Job of the prologue and the Job of the dialogue? Let's see if anyone gets it. How would you say the tone is in the prologue? How is Job behaving in the prologue in terms of his general attitude, and how is he behaving? I mean, the tone of his voice, right? Let's imagine the tone of his voice, how it's changed. Williams, you want to give it a try?
Well, he kind of sounds whiny and like a child, very immature. He felt that is not going his way, so I'm gonna throw a tantrum, basically.
Very good. Actually, some of the rabbis agree with you. They're like, you know, Job wasn't complaining when other people were suffering, and all of a sudden now that he's suffering, here he is, right? Making big statements about where is God, right? So actually the rabbis, there's some rabbis that are not sympathetic to Job at all, right? They're like, oh, now you're gonna make a big deal, right? And what about before when other people were suffering? You were quite silent then, right? So they actually agree with you that he seems to be throwing a tantrum now that the suffering is directed at him, right? But you make a good point. He's emotionally shifted. And this is my last point. In the prologue, there is no emotionality except fear, right? Job is just kind of very uptight, right? Walking the line, yashar, right? That's maybe what it means, yashar, when it means literally. Remember, yashar, I told you, literally means straight. It could also just mean he was walking the line, right? He's walking the line, he's doing everything perfect. He's actually walking on eggshells. You can sense that he's just meticulously trying to make, so there's not much, you know, emotional depth in the character in the beginning. But when we get into the dialogues, all of a sudden we have the whole spectrum. We have anger, rage, frustration, hopelessness, despair, right? And so this is the last point, and then I'll get the other questions, right? The last, he moves from being robotic, right, unemotional, to being emotional, passionate, right? Can't write today, passionate. Okay, there's a couple more questions I see here. So let's start with Hartstark and then Williams again.
With all due respect, I think it is crazy to say that he is having a tantrum and being like a childish for being upset that his 10 children were killed and stuff like that. That's like, I'm pretty sure that's like a natural human reaction. And like, I don't know how much time passed between this. Was it 7 days? I guess it was 7 days. I think most people would be like pretty distraught at this point. So like, and even if the rabbis say like, why is he upset? Why does he care now? He didn't care then. Like, is there enough information to really say that he didn't care then, or we're just like speculating?
Oh, the rabbis are always speculating.
Right. I'm saying like, yeah, you're right, correct. But then it's like, why do we have to assume?
Yeah.
It's like have such a negative perspective about him.
I think as the rabbis love to say, both views have their place, right? I think Williams has a point when she says, you know, some people would think that Job, you know, is a little bit, you know, spoiled in the sense that, you know, he hasn't spoken up before, but you have a point too, that something tragic happened, his whole family died, right? So what's beautiful about wisdom literature is that you can read it in different ways. It's meant to be read in different ways, right? It's meant to speak to each one of us in different ways. It's more of a personal, right, literature. So in general, you can actually say both things, and the text validates it, right? So it's, and the rabbis, they enjoyed having a multiplicity of perspectives, right? You have to, otherwise it gets boring. Does it make sense? Who were you? I'm still learning your names. Who were you? Hartstark. Does that make sense a little bit?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with you though. I agree with you and Williams at the same time. Okay, I think, Williams, did you have your hand up? Or no, it came back down. Milgram, you want to add?
I just have a comment. I I feel like, I mean, I understand that this is the only information that we have about Job, but like, it feels kind of unfair to like make such like definitive, like categorizations about him just based on like a bunch of verses. And obviously one could argue that like these verses are specifically like trying to illustrate a certain point, but like the fact that after his suffering comes like chapters upon chapters upon chapters, and before his suffering we just get like a bunch of verses, just feels like we can't really weigh each equally in terms of like judging who he is, because one just like provides a lot more information than the other.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, all we know is that there is a shift, right? For sure, Job changes from the beginning to the end, right? And what we're trying to do is establish a somewhat clear portrait of who he was before, because by the way, this is who we are before suffering, right? Let's not think that we're just bashing Job. The story of Job is a story about the human condition, right? So whatever is being said about Job can be said about us before we go through the trials of suffering, right? All of us can be yashar, walk the line, tam, naive, until we've suffered, right? So try to see Job more as a parable of the human condition, and that will help, right? Because then we can then project ourselves into the story, and then it begins to make sense, right? Do you see what I'm saying, Milgram? Milgram, are you there?
Oh yeah, sorry, I was nodding. Yes, I do.
Yeah, I don't see you guys. Okay,
Sorry,
very good.
I keep forgetting.
Okay, so make sure you have written down, right, these 3 points. And by the way, the quote for the last one, from robotic to emotional, you have on page 22. So remember, make sure you're jotting down these quotes, right? Because you're going to need them for the test when you give your answer. So on page 22, from the bottom, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 lines from the bottom on 22. If you have it, put your hand on the screen. Okay, great. So he says this, he says, do you want to disprove my passion or argue away my despair, right? So he's basically, his friends are trying to calm him down and be like, come on, calm down, stop being so crazy, try to be like, put yourself together. And Job is like, no, I'm not going to put myself together. I'm going to continue to explode and, come undone like I've been doing, right? Now, what's interesting, so we have a very, very new portrait now of Job, right? We had someone who was kind of fearful, pretty clear about himself, unemotional. All of a sudden now we see someone who has come undone, right? We are witnessing Job falling apart, right? In front of our eyes. And what's interesting is that the text, in the end, at least, if you've read till the end, which you haven't, some of you, but if you've read till the end, can anyone tell me how God reacts to all of this craziness that Job is spouting, to all of his nonsense? How does God feel about it? What do you see for those who have read the end? How does God feel about Job, and how does God, in contrast, feel about the friends who told Job to calm down? Anybody know? Which one does God prefer? The friends who were telling Job, come on, be careful, don't speak like that about God, right? Or Job in all his mess and craziness? Who does God prefer based on the ending, for those of you who've read the ending? Yes, Wrestler, go ahead.
In the end, I guess like he approves more of Job for like his I guess a resilience, and also like the fact that he still cares about his friends and still wants what's best for them. Okay, so you're right? So surprisingly, in the end of the story, instead of God coming to Job and being like, how could you, right? How could you lose it like that? God actually, instead of defending the friends who kept on telling Job, be careful, don't say that, don't say this, calm down. He's like, please make a sacrifice for your friends because they really, really piss me off, right? So this is very interesting. It's as though, in a way, Job's coming apart, Job's falling apart, his anger, his emotionality, his rebelliousness, his crossing the line, his confusion, actually, God seems to appreciate that.
And that's very strange. So we'll have to talk about that in a second, right? But what we're getting here is typical of wisdom literature, right? In wisdom literature, we meet a God who wants us to be real, right? Who doesn't need all the fake smiles and all the, you know, putting on a show, right? This is the God of the wisdom books, is a God which actually appreciates it when you are most fully yourself, right? When you're coming apart, when you're at your worst, when you're going crazy, this is not something that God despises. On the contrary, at that moment, he finds you particularly irresistible, right? Wilkes, go ahead. Wilkes?
I was just gonna say that the shift between the prologue and the dialogue and the end of the story was kind of like Job was at first just following, you know, God's rules, and now this has become an actual conversation between him and God. Like they're now bargaining and they're now establishing a personal connection.
Yes, excellent. That's another excellent point. Let me add to what you said, right? The difference between Job and his friends, and make sure you guys write this down, is that the friends speak about God, whereas Job, for the first time, has crossed the threshold and he's speaking to God. Suffering will bring you to that point, right? Before the pain, we just talk about God, right? When we are in the pain, that is the moment when we are suffering so much that something in us explodes, something opens up, right? And we have the opportunity, we have the impulse to address God directly. And that's what Job does, right? Something in him breaks, but it's also something which propels him and in a way, it pushes him into the arms of God, right? In a way, suffering has a way of doing that, right? Suffering has a way of creating proximity between us and God. And sometimes we take that chance and sometimes we reject it. But suffering does open a breach, right? Through which we can gain closer access to God, which is what Job is doing. In all of his craziness, he's actually gaining access, closer access to God than his friends. Now, this is so interesting because what we're learning is that actually what Job is going through right now, what is happening to Job is that he's actually becoming, for the first time, human, right? Before, he was this kind of perfect Christian or perfect Jew, perfect Muslim, right? He was putting on a show. Now, for the first time, we see Job in his full humanity, in his brokenness, in his emotionality, in his confusion. He's lost, he's despairing. At that moment, he's most deeply human. And remember what human means, right? Human, the word human in the Latin comes from the word humus, which means earth, right? So Job at that moment has been thrown back on his humanity. He has become earth. He has lost everything. Suffering does that. This is one of the powerful transformative effects of suffering. It takes away all your masks. It takes away all your attitude. It takes away all your status, and it grinds you to your humanity. And at that moment, anything can happen, right? You can either crumble and die, or you can, as Job will, resurrect a new person, right? But the suffering grinds you to powder. And some people's suffering breaks them and they never emerge. But some of us, if we choose it, the suffering can allow us to be reborn into something new with the earth. But first we have to be ground to powder. And that is this is such an important lesson, which a lot of us are not aware of when we suffer. When we suffer, we want to quickly avoid the suffering, right? We don't understand that the suffering is taking you, is grinding you into this new earth, into just pure earth, from which you could be reborn if you allow it, right? Suffering is always a process of rebirth if we allow it. But first, we have to be ground. I don't know. Check it, which past tense it is, right? But we have to be grinded or ground to earth, right? So Job becomes human, and it's at that moment, this is so powerful, it's at that moment that he connects to God. In other words, the path to God passes through our humanity. It's in as much as you're most connected to your humanity, as you're most authentically human and real, that you're going to connect to God. All the facades, all the masks, all the, you know, fakeness has to go before you can really connect to God. And so this is very powerful, because in most world religions, to connect to God, you have to leave behind your humanity. You have to be, you can't be human. You have to be more than human. You have to be perfect and good and so forth. Here we're seeing that actually the more imperfect you are, the more broken you are and lost and confused you are, the closer you are to God, right? The Hebrew Bible says in the Psalms, God is close to the brokenhearted, right? There's a reason for that, because you are now earth, and now anything could happen, right? So that's what we see, which is so powerful in this moment, right? Where Job is transforming. He's coming undone, he's confused, he's lost, he doesn't know what's happening, but we know, right, what's where he's headed, right? And all of us, when we suffer, and this is why the story is so fundamental for us, because when we're in the middle of suffering, we don't see this, but the story is telling us, wait, you're being turned into earth, you're being pushed into a new mold, you're being made anew if you allow it. Any type of suffering can make you into a new person, which is better than the first, right? If you allow it, if you don't escape it, right? I think there was another question by, oh, I saw a hand and then it disappeared. Was it Wilkes? Did you have a question? Guess not. Okay. Good. All right. Now that we're done with this part of Job, the next part that you have to read is going to be God's answer. Here's where we have to pay close attention, because that's where the author wants us to pay close attention. Now, your homework, apart from reading it, right, and doing the reading assignment, I want you to tell me, I'm going to ask you next time, are you satisfied with God's answer in the speech that he makes? That's the question I'm going to ask you. Okay, everybody got it? Put your hand on the screen if you see what I'm saying. I'm going to ask you, are you satisfied? And half of you, I predict, will hate the answer, and half of you will love it. So we're going to look at that answer. We're going to analyze it. We're going to try to find the deeper layers of meaning, right? Nothing is obvious in the book of Job, right? Everything is subtle. So we'll have to kind of really excavate and dig through this text, right? But that's the question I want you to remember. Are you satisfied with his answer? And then we'll also study the so-called happy ending. We're going to see if we can really agree with the happy ending that is described at the end. Okay, last thing before we stop. I'm there, just so you know, there's a tutor that is available for this class for everybody, right? Not only for Sikh students. I'm going to give you her email. So if you have any struggles and you want to make an appointment with her for free, right? If you want to go over aspects of the text with her, or if you're struggling, or if you have a dumb question like what assignment is due next time, her, okay? Not me. So all of your questions, right, that you want to ask me, you first ask her. She's my prophet. Okay. So, and then if she can't respond, then ask me. So I'm going to put her email in the chat. So she's the one that you want to go to if you have any question about anything. So sharon.mejia@qc.cuny.edu. So that's the name of the class tutor. Sikh students, I would like you to email her right now. So if you're a Sikh student, right now on your phone, you email her so she can have you in her contacts, right? The rest of you, you can use her anytime you want to. I mean, you can appeal to her anytime you want to, especially if you have, little questions about assignments and stuff that you don't understand how to do. It's better to go to her. And she is very experienced with the classes I teach, so she'll be able to respond to you. Okay, any other questions before we conclude? So Sikh students, you're writing Mejia right now, right? You're writing to the tutor right now. Where are you, my Sikhs? Raise your hands. Okay, great. Okay, so right now you're sending her an email, right? And the rest of you, this is for you if you have any other questions. All right, I'm gonna stop the recording.